Welcome to the reading of tributes of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I'm the president of the Academy, Kwame Anthony Appiah. Since 1903, the Academy has presented tributes to members who have passed away. We continue the tradition tonight with tributes to one artist, one composer, and two writers. Out of respect for the memory of the deceased, please refrain from applause following the reading of the tributes. The tribute to John Baldessari will be read by Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe.
Like modernism, the time when one could lock oneself out of one's car has been a thing of the past for some time now, unless you're poor. One day, when anyone could lock themselves out of the car, which was always accompanied by realizing that what one had just done a moment too late, I called John Baldessari. His studio was nearby, and I asked him to please bring me a coat hanger, the tool of choice for opening locked car doors. He accused me of smoking too much dope and was there in 5 minutes. Smiling, he handed me a coat hanger made out of a piece of solid plastic. We both knew that I wanted a wire coat hanger, which could be bent into a kind of hook for grabbing the door lock that was tantalizing in sight behind the car window. So I resisted the instinct to start waving my arms around in exasperation and just waited, and in a minute or less, John handed me a wire coat hanger. I'll always remember John for his sense of humor. Likewise, I'll always remember with fondness his impatience with bullshit. John and I had known one another since the early 1970s, and in 1980 he invited me to teach at Cal Arts. Once a year or so, the faculty would review the work of people who were applying to the program. If there were painters among them, their work would be subjected to quite a different level of scrutiny than the work of others, as there was at least one member of the faculty who thought painting had no place in a school which, for no good reason, believed itself to be characterized by a theoretical sophistication well beyond the intellectual scope of any painter. Eventually and inevitably, the interrogation would lead to the charge that the work was inconsistent. Here John would chime in and demand to know what was so great about consistency. What if doing things the way you're not supposed to is interesting in itself in some way, and in that more engaging than doing what you're expected to do, either because of what you've done previously or just because of generally established rules of practice? He never got a good answer, or indeed any answer at all, because accusing the applicant of being inconsistent was just an excuse for excluding painters. No one really cared about consistency, and John's question had made that clear. A sense of humor and impatience with disingenuousness were not only endearing qualities of John's at the personal level, but they were also the basis of the art he made. A sense of humor runs through the work, while his impatience with rules is there from the beginning, where it is expressed precisely in the premise that what is worth doing might have everything to do with breaking rules, and also with insisting on directness rather than dissembling. It isn't directly relevant here, but it nonetheless seems worth noting that one of John's favorite sayings was, "If a job's worth doing, it's worth doing it badly." John's work began with simple but absurd appeals to the audience's sense of humor as contained in pointless gestures, but by the 80s the work had settled into an intensity that had its foundation in apparent complexity. The early works tended to be of single acts, describing peas in a pod one after the other, the doomed attempt to make four balls form a perfect square when thrown together in the air, photographing oneself directly in front of a tree so that it seemed to be growing out of one's head, all worthy of attention because they weren't. Their point was they were pointless, absurd, above all lacking in seriousness. My favorite early work has to be the little group called Baggage Suite, because it works by redundancy that transforms rather than repeats. A man walking without a prosthesis is provided with a crutch, and suddenly smooth competence is rendered awkward by what should be eliminating awkwardness. By the 80s, the work had developed into a density that was the result of components united by an equally complicated composition. By then, the materials used to make the work could be quite sophisticated too. I think John may have got some advice about how to use that sophistication. Elephant Weight, Blue, 1986, for example, includes both vinyl paint and oil paint, together with black and white photography. The images suggest, but do not deliver a story, delivering sensation without explanation. Ashley Bickerton, a former student of both of ours, expressed surprise that John took care to keep up with everything that was going on in the art world to an extent that those who studied with him didn't realize. I think he probably took care to know what was going on with the collectors and those in charge of the museums far more assiduously than what might be happening in criticism or theory, which may have led him to miss some things. Be that as it may, John was the only artist I have known who read and applied Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, while also being able to say confidently that as far as he knew, nothing in his career had ever been influenced up or down by anything that had been written about his work. But John's wanting to keep up with everything was by no means limited to the art world, and it wasn't only events and facts about who had the power that interested him. He was also interested in how things felt. In one of our last conversations, he told me he would have liked to go to a Trump rally. When Obama gave John the National Medal of Arts, he had lifted the president off the floor while hugging him. With Trump, it was the opposite kind of story. John wanted to see for himself how Trump managed to captivate his followers, much as one would want to see how Hitler did the same thing. John, like most of us, didn't understand the appeal and wanted to know if seeing it in action emotionally might help to explain it. I don't know if he ever did sneak into a rally, quite a difficult feat, but maybe much easier in that a Trump rally would be the one place where he was unlikely to be recognized, or if he did, whether he got anything out of it. But I was impressed by his wanting to do it. Incidentally, it goes some way to explaining why, when loyal fans seek to duplicate his methodology, they fail. It's because they don't take the trouble to examine their sensations as opposed to relying on just concepts. Art is much more about involuntary responses, which one can't help but have, than it is about anything recognizing familiar expectations which remain just that, rather than somehow inexplicably leading somewhere one didn't want to go. John's work began with simple but absurd appeals to the audience's sense of humor, as contained in pointless gestures, but by the 80s the work had settled into an intense complexity that if it still implied questions, it answered none. What world was he living in by the time he died? Hal Foster recently said that as we get farther away from modernism, we get closer to the 19th century. John was born in 1931, only 25 years after Cézanne died, a proximity we notice now as we didn't in the early 70s. At the same time, we may be after modernism, but find ourselves back in some gloomy and petty period, best described not so much as post or pre-modernist, as never modernist. John said he always supported the goals of political art, but was never impressed by the art itself. His was an art of contemplation, but we live now in a period when the opposite, an art entirely devoted to propaganda, seems to be what's in charge. For John, as for me as far as that goes, that was and is uninteresting, both because we already know the story and because the way it's told is also no surprise. All it can do is pander, when what John wanted to do is puzzle. Thank you very much.
The tribute to Barry Lopez will be read by John Luther Adams.
I was looking for anyone who could speak the language of the God of no particular religion. Barry Lopez gave us words to live by, words of remembrance, words of longing, words of compassion, words of resistance. Whenever I read Barry's words, I hear his voice. That resonant baritone voice is clear and bracing as a mountain stream. And the cadences of his speech, as precise and perfectly measured as the words themselves. Barry's often called a nature writer. He is not. He is sometimes called a travel writer. He is not. Although the locus of Barrie's writing is frequently in landscape, the central subject of his work is the human heart. With fierce intellect and deep compassion in luminous prose, Barrie gives us stories of wolves and men, of traveling with and learning from indigenous people, stories of narwhal, polar bears, and vanishing sea ice. Stories of the larger, older world that in our dangerously alienated culture we call nature. Like Thoreau before him, Barrie turned to the larger-than-human world, not to escape from humanity, but to engage more passionately with the largest questions of what it means to be fully human. An unsettled childhood left Barrie with an intense hunger to find home. Sexual abuse left him with a burning sense of defiance and a fierce determination to make things right. Barrie's formal education took place in the context of Roman Catholicism. As a young man trying to understand the direction his life should take, he visited the monastery where Thomas Merton lived and worked, with the thought that he might find his own vocation there. But Barrie recognized that his was a very different calling. Turning away from life as a contemplative, he brought the same sense of devotion to his life as a writer. Barrie spoke of his work as prayer. Through his writings, he bore witness. He gave voice to our grief, along with a generous measure of solace. Against the barrage of constant crisis and commodified fear in the mass media, Barrie extends to us an invitation to step outside of internet time, to renew our attention to deeper rhythms, to remember our true place within the patterns that connect all life. His work is both a celebration and a lamentation, the expression of his abiding wonder at the beauty and the terror of the world, his horror at the violence that we humans inflict on one another and on the earth, and his faith in the possibility of human redemption. Here, in this life, on this earth, the only home that any of us will ever know. From his travels with indigenous people, Barrie came to understand the urgent need for those of us living in this culture of decay to imagine new cultures, living within the limits of biology. As he put it, a formal inquiry into disintegration and the attempt to achieve reintegration is an emerging force in the arts today, just as it is in archaeology and field biology. It's part of a much larger determination far and wide across human cultures to understand the fission of integrated communities. Barrie's community of friends was expansive, a diaspora of creative thinkers and culture bearers that encompassed native elders, field biologists, fellow writers, painters, potters, photographers, even composers. For almost 40 years, Barrie was my beloved friend and constant companion in creative work. Barrie and I drew encouragement from one another and from the feeling that we were doing the same work in different disciplines. Barrie's work as a writer, like my work as a composer, was solitary. Yet, although we were usually thousands of miles apart, just knowing that Barrie was in his studio doing his work made my own studio feel a little less lonely. Over the years, Barrie and I worked together on several projects. In the 1990s, we brought his children's book, Crow and Weasel, to the stage. In 2 consecutive summers, we and our collaborators convened in the mountains of Utah for intensive workshops on the production. The second year, I arrived directly from recording sessions, bearing the rough mix of a new piece. In Dream in White on White, I aspired to leave imagery and narrative behind, to create music that would somehow evoke the feeling of being in a place, without painting a picture or telling a story about any specific landscape. I was eager for Barry to hear this music, and he was eager to listen. So I handed him a CD, and he disappeared. A couple of hours later, we convened in the sauna of the house where we were staying. We settled onto the benches, breathed in the dry heat, and exhaled deeply. Then Barry said, "It's beautiful, John. It reminds me of being on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in early spring. You know, when the world is still white, but flooded with light." I burst out laughing. "Damn it, Barry, that's exactly where it comes from." Barry knew that sprawling landscape as well as I did. And what I'd imagined was my own secret narrative, he had heard loud and clear. So much for leaving the story behind. Many of the most memorable moments that Barry and I shared were in Alaska. Near the end of his life, he told me that he'd come to understand that Alaska was the place where the full dimensions of his work had taken shape. It was Alaska's great poet, John Haynes, who had first brought Barry and me together. Yet, just as John belonged to the boreal forest overlooking the Tanana River and the peaks of the central Alaska Range, Barry belonged to the rainforest of the Mackenzie River on the west slope of the Cascades. As he traveled from the high Arctic to the Antarctic, from the outback of Australia to the war zones of the Middle East, Barry always came home to the sheltering embrace of the firs and hemlocks and the ever-changing music of the river. It was here that he wrote most of Arctic Dreams, of Wolves and Men, so many other articles and books of essays and stories. It was here over the course of 28 years that he worked on his most urgent and visionary book, Horizon. For 50 years, that forest was Barry's refuge, until late summer 2020. In the middle of the night, the phone rang. The voice on the other end said that one of the largest wildfires in Oregon was roaring down slope, directly toward the house. The frontline firefighters were on the way, and Barry and Deborah needed to evacuate immediately. They grabbed the house cat, threw a few things into the car, and fled downriver. In the days that followed, in a motel room in Eugene, they waited for whatever news they could glean from upriver. They learned that the nearby village and the houses closest to theirs had been destroyed. One fatality had been uncovered, and body-sniffing dogs were searching for others. Eventually, when they were permitted to return to the charred forest, they discovered that the small cabin that housed Barry's archives had burned to the ground. Miraculously, their house and guest cabin were still standing, although too badly damaged to be inhabitable. 3 months later, Barry passed away. It's cruelly ironic that the forest where he had settled in order to protect the trees has now been logged to salvage the remains. And it's nothing less than tragic that this man who was such a strong, clear voice of warning about climate change died as a climate refugee. In Crow and Weasel, the wise woman Badger instructs the two young pilgrims. Remember this one thing. The stories people tell have a way of taking care of them. If stories come to you, care for them and learn to give them away where they're needed. Barry devoted his life to the gift of stories. In the weeks after the wildfire swept down his valley, Barry told me that he'd begun making notes under the title, The Story I Will Never Write. As he knew, he did not live to finish it. Yet Barry's story must be told, as must so many similar stories from all over the earth. This is how we will care for ourselves now and in the turbulent times that lie ahead. We need to put these stories into each other's memories, to listen as deeply as we can. Then we must face the terrifying visions looming on the horizon. If we turn away, if we choose not to listen, the consequences may be more horrific than we can imagine. We need these stories now to stay alive. In Arctic Dreams, in a passage about the life ways of the Inuit, Barry writes, "And once in a great while, an Asumatuk becomes apparent, a person who can create the atmosphere in which wisdom shows itself. This is a timeless wisdom that survives human economies. It survives wars. It survives definition. It is a nameless wisdom esteemed by all people. It is an understanding how to live a decent life, how to behave properly toward other people and toward the land." Barry Lopez was an Asumatuk. In his life and work, Barry created an atmosphere in which wisdom will continue to reveal itself for generations to come. Barry gave us words to live by, words to light the darkness, words of empathy and encouragement for those who will embrace the burning world, who will imagine and work to create new cultures, new ways of living together with one another and with the larger community of life on this blessed earth.
The tribute to Ned Rorem will be read by David Del Tredici.
He was godlike to me, infinitely aware of his effect on people, places, and treasured things. Coming as I did only a generation or so after Ned, I found we often traveled the same path. I was privileged exactly 20 years ago to present Ned our gold medal, awarded in recognition of an American composer's entire body of work. First presented in 1919, the Academy's highest recognition has over the years been given to many composers, including Aaron Copland, Virgil Thompson, Samuel Barber, Leonard Bernstein, and Stephen Sondheim, all, of course, distinguished. Ned, however, eclipsed each of them in at least two respects. First, with his longer name, First, will their ever longer names ever be quite so familiar to crossword puzzle aficionados? And would any of them have ever contemplated having his scandalous personal journals published, and so voluminously? Still, in 1976, it was not in literature, but for music that Ned had been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. This was in addition to a Fulbright and two Guggenheim Fellowships awarded from the National Institute of Arts and Letters and ASCAP for lifetime achievement, and yes, a Knight of the French Order of Arts and Letters. Once hailed by Time magazine as the world's best composer of art songs, and he produced hundreds of them, he ranged far beyond that genre. For orchestra, he composed 3 symphonies, 3 piano sonatas, and for an array of other works, not to be mentioned, his chamber works, 8 operas, choral works of every description, ballet, and music for the theater. In all, a truly formidable body of work. How on earth had he done this? Served as the Academy's president for 2003, or visited the Everhard Baths. And 2 years later, instead of retiring at age 82, he was able to, in his inimitable way, to write an opera of our town that most Americans, something like that, that most American of works. But I'd like to focus on the countless gifts that Ned Rorem gave us. In the beginning, of course, Ned was a gift to Richmond, Indiana, where he was born in 1923. But most noteworthy is Ned's creative genius and extraordinary musical achievement. Time and again, for the best part of his nearly 100 years, Ned himself gave birth to music that has been such a wonderful gift to audiences everywhere. He was a gift, above all, to the art song tradition, which for him might have vanished from the American musical scene. Likewise, Ned was a gift for our orchestral and chamber music literature, which, but for him, would be sadly diminished. But for Ned, the continuity into the 21st century of lucid musical craft and refined musical rhetoric would be imperiled. In so many ways, Ned, as a musical centrist, brought composers together. When a generation ago we were engaged in the great war of atonality versus tonality, Ned loyally kept to his tonal guns, and much younger composers, myself included, drew courage from his example. Ned was also an innovative musical formalist. In one composition after another, he gave us a rich profusion of fanciful short movements, followed one another in place of the traditional 3 or 4 movements. This too gave fresh inspiration to fledgling composers. Of special note is the fact that Ned accomplished all this in an openly gay man, perhaps the first serious composer in America so to dare, a place where many others were unwilling to go. 57 years ago, when Ned's Paris Diary was published, shock and awe likewise greeted his self-identification as a gay man. Shock, of course, was there a commonplace reaction to such self-revelation, particularly among classical musicians. Awe, however, was the reaction of gay composers, such as myself, for whom his bold step was positively liberating. In other words, what dear Ned gave everyone again and again is simply himself. The world will little know nor long remember what I say here, but it can never forget, so long as music thrives in our sanctuary, sacred community, what Ned Rorem had meant to do and has meant to do. What happened to me? Ned Rorem has meant to do so many of us.
The tribute to Richard Howard will be read by Grace Schulman.
Richard Howard was my friend for half a century. I was never a student in his famous poetry classes, but our relationship was enlightening in its own way. I was his neighbor. We lived a block apart in downtown New York, near Washington Square Park. I could peer at him having dinner through the window at what was once our local deli, engrossed in his book more than in his salad. Walking on Waverly Place, I'd see him turn the corner in his purple duffel coat, yanking the leash of his pug Maud, and later of Maud's successor, Jeed, both dogs bearing Richard's gaze of fierce concentration. When we stopped to chat, he would refer to a recent pen party in words that were ironic, satiric, and lovingly accurate. He would excitingly praise the poems of a woman writer he just discovered. He would talk about poems he was writing and ask to see my new work. Once he interrupted our conversation to ask if I knew that this was the very site of Henry James' birth on Washington Square. Living near Richard meant I could visit him frequently in his apartment that was, like his writing, compact, with no space wasted. There were literally thousands of books, floor to ceiling. Books were interspersed with drawings and photographs of friends. On a table by Richard's desk, a faux Tiffany lamp gave off an orange-red glow that animated conversation. In a nook were his bed, a giant stuffed gorilla named Mildred, and Prada Place, a painting of koi fish by his beloved husband, David Alexander. Actually, the work looks like a radiant painting, but is a digital monoprint of form practiced by David. Early in our friendship, I learned that Richard constantly read and edited the work of new poets and made comments related not to his work but to theirs. His flair for newness is evident in his editions of emerging writers. In Alone with America, his book of essays about 1960s poets, he sees a luminous present as the gift of history, indebted to the past. It was a past he explored by translating numerous classics from the French, including Baudelaire's Fleur du Mal, for which he won a National Book Award. The love of past writers started early, when he was 2 years old, learning to read in his grandfather's library. I once asked, "Are there any gaps in your reading?" "Yes," he replied, 14th century Japan. I learned later that he was taking lessons in Japanese to read the original. Richard was a study in contrasts. On one hand, he was elegantly stylish, striding in red-rimmed glasses, a red hat, and red socks, and brandishing a priceless vocabulary which had been enhanced by an early job as a lexicographer. On the other hand, he had a down-home manner. Visiting him once, I found him standing at the washing machine, proud of his efficiency in handling wet clothes. Reading at the Y, he swept on stage with formidable hauteur, and yet he was quick to substitute for a poet who was ill and to volunteer as first reader for a poetry contest. Once he came to my college, Baruch, arriving within 3 hours of a request to pinch hit for a featured writer. When there was a job to do for poetry, however unsung, unpaid, uncredited, or lowly, Richard would spring for it. Above all, he was patiently kind to new writers, and yet displayed a knife-sharp wit, as in his definition of the eulogy as that genre of autobiography. In writing this tribute, I've tried to heed that quip and keep myself out of it. In his poetry, Richard is known for his reinvention of the dramatic monologue. His speakers are artistic and literary figures such as Bonnat, Edith Wharton, and Robert Browning. The monologues of his early work, prominent in Untitled Subjects, the book that won him a Pulitzer, develop into the encounters of two-part inventions. My favorite of the two parts is Wildflowers, a dialogue between a youthful Oscar Wilde and an aging Whitman. I saw it performed in a village theater and thought it enchanting as a play, though when it closed, Richard returned to poetry, his main chance. The playwriting venture was like his attempt not at a novel, but at the novel, so called, he said, because a poet wrote it. Although the poems have been acknowledged for their erudition, they are most moving for what they tell us of a lived life. This is best described in one of his lines. Surely everything one does enters into what one writes. Richard merges with his speakers and in the process discovers himself. As translator, he is submerged in what he once called an exchange of mental fluids. And this passionate identification carries over into his poetry. It is an erotic submission, or, an erotic imposition, as Richard calls his own working method, in a Paris Review interview by the writer we Academy members know as Sandy McClatchy. Further in that interview, he calls himself a scroptophiliac, a lavish word I enjoyed looking up, which means something like a peeping Tom. And to be sure, Eros is found in many of the puns Richard can keep himself from making. Buggers can be choosers. Abstinence makes the heart meander. Or shift, fellatio. I stand among the many mourners of Richard Howard. I find him still here. In his telephone message, your call will be returned when the occasion allows. In his humor, his no-nonsense wisdom, his insistence on what he called appropriate behavior, and in his unshaken belief, comparable to that of 4th century Lucchese Wenfu, in the morality of good writing.